by far, the most oft asked question I get on the channel is where did I get my Baker rifle? Now it's time to answer that question. Bloody geese! When I first started the series on the Baker rifle here on the channel, the very first video published ended with this line.
You need a Baker rifle.
Now, in a half-joking but half-serious consideration of that statement, it may have been somewhat disingenuous, as getting a Baker rifle into your hands is much easier said than done.
The Baker rifle, more properly known as the infantry rifle in the era, was perhaps the most iconic arm of the period, and complemented its larger caliber and much more numerous cousin, the Brown Bess. Although the numbers in service paled in comparison to those of the Bess, it maintains its legendary status to this day. The Baker holds its place in modern legend and lore due to one man. Or actually, really should be this guy. So, for those of you who've been living in glorious isolation for the past 40 years or so, Bernard Cornwell is the author of the Sharp series of novels. These historical fiction works are eminently readable, swashbuckling tales of Richard Sharp, a ranker-cum-officer in the British Army in the Age of Wellington. He came from humble beginnings in the red-coated ranks of the 33rd Foot, and rises to colonel after commissioning initially into the 74th Highlanders. His commissioning being a reward for saving the life of Arthur Wellesley, who of course would go on to become the Duke of Wellington. He would very shortly after transfer to the 95th Rifles. The novels are fictitious, of course, set against the backdrop, or actually participating in, most of the famous actions and campaigns from Assaye to Waterloo and beyond. His character is somewhat similar to another famous swashbuckler, Harry Flashman, of George MacDonald Fraser's creation. To those who are familiar with both, there are, of course, meaningful differences in the characters, mostly relating to bravery and fidelity. But I digress. Famously, Sharp, in the novels, carries a soldier's weapon, a Baker rifle, and in an act of supreme artistic license, a 1796 pattern heavy cavalry sword. Accompanying Sharp on his adventures are an intrepid band of so-called chosen men, which were, in actuality, proto-lance corporals, and wore a ring of lace around their upper arm as their badge. They, of course, being from the ranks of the 95th, also carried the Baker rifle. The novels existed as a standalone series until the 1990s, when efforts to make them into a TV series were undertaken. And that's when the insatiable public appetite for all things Baker really took off.
Bastards. Bastard. That bastard was gone off.
The man who played Sharp was Sean Bean, before he started dying everywhere he went.
Little bastard.
Despite suffering from an appalling lack of budget, these TV episodes, loosely based on the books, captured the imagination of thousands and thousands. Within these storied collections of print and film lies the immeasurable draw of the Baker rifle. So it's perhaps understandable that on the channel here, especially when Baker content is published, undoubtedly the most prolific question that gets asked is, as stated, where did I get my Baker? And a follow-on, where can I get one? This is a 1-2 combination that I answer on a nearly daily basis sometimes. It goes to show you just how much interest there is in this historic arm. I think in the context of this video, answering the latter question first would be most appropriate. Where can one acquire a Baker rifle of their own? The first thing that must be realized when marching down the road to Baker ownership is managing your expectations. Now, this undoubtedly is not what people want to hear, but to arrive with that arm, as described by its name, in your actual hands takes patience, money, and appreciation of the history, and also the technical side of this rifle. Perhaps the first stage in managing your expectations is deciding whether or not you need a Baker rifle or a Baker smoothbore carbine. As the literal name implies, the Baker is a rifle. The original had 7 square bottom grooves, making one turn in 120 inches. If this is what you want, a Baker rifle, then you need to prepare yourself for a wild ride. But more on that later. For those without the means or the desire for the utmost in authenticity and, more importantly, capability, then I give you the smoothbore Baker rifle, if that could actually be a thing. Now, I am by no means being disparaging to those who have selected this route. It's just the fact that referring to a smoothbore arm as a rifle defies a certain degree of logic. Far and away, the most common type of Baker out on the market is a smoothbore reproduction of varying quality and finish. These are overwhelmingly made in India, some in their entirety, and others are refurbished and refinished to a degree by various companies in the Western world. These examples are wholly geared to the reenactor community, who, for the most part, have no requirement for the use of live ammunition. Come to think of it, I've never heard of a reenactment that has called for it. That's probably a good thing. This, of course, doesn't preclude the use of live ammunition for historical shooting purposes, as seen here by members of the 2nd Battalion 95th Rifles in the UK. These also appeal to those who just want a facsimile to hang on the wall or to show friends, or simply to own a piece of Sharp's Rifles memorabilia, as it were. Let's look at what one of these smoothbore Bakers gets you. Firstly, I'll preface this by saying that there are a great many Baker rifle reproductions on the market. Mileage may vary, and it pays to ask questions and do your research. Firstly, they mostly come with a reasonable approximation of the shape, look, and dimensions of an original. They do not generally match closely, however. The stock is usually of some exotic subcontinental tropical wood, which may come varnished with lacquer or some such. The inletting is typically quite rough, if serviceable. Dimensions can differ as well, with a thicker feel in the hand and somewhat fuzzier interpretation of the shape. The furniture is typically serviceable, if somewhat generously cast, and I have yet to see an example that didn't use at least proper brass. The locks are of a range of quality, from barely functioning to quite serviceable. But what they nearly all lack is the proper form. The cock is invariably of the swan neck variety, which is appropriate for post-war Bakers of the 1823 pattern, but not for Bakers of the Napoleonic Wars. Reproduction Bakers, in nearly all cases, seek to replicate the most common version of the rifle, the so-called 1805 pattern. They usually have the simple, rounded patchbox of that pattern and a single compartment within. The pattern also has a 2-position backsight, and the ramrod often has a funny shape to it, being unusually thick at the end. Now the most important component, the barrel. These are typically provided in 2 forms, with and without a touch hole, depending on the vendor. This is done to circumvent regulations in some countries by making the examples unfireable and thus not a firearm. Drilling of a touch hole can be done by a qualified individual. This is perhaps the component that deserves the most scrutiny, as it will in many cases have to contain the charge, and therefore safety considerations are paramount. Some vendors provide proofing instructions, others strictly sell them as non-firing replicas. In all cases, a bit of research and the questioning of vendors is important. If this is the type of Baker you want or are allowed through regulation, then I suggest you do your research, ask questions, and carefully consider the answers. The smoothbore Bakers are the cheapest and by far the most available on the market. There are many vendors with examples for sale at various price points. Now, we've already established the arm for the non-serious shooter, the casual reenactor, or the simple enthusiast. But what if you want a true Baker rifle for serious shooting or living history? In short, there are no examples commercially available at this point, and there have not been since the originals were made. But never fear, there are options. It's important to know that all of these options will take from many months to years to achieve, and in some cases a large increase in the financial effort. Perhaps the most achievable is to have your Indian smoothbore Baker re-barreled. Some vendors will offer a contact to which you send your newly purchased smoothbore baker for a new professionally made rifled barrel. You'll have to inquire with the individual vendors or make inquiries with other gunsmiths or shops to find the best solution for you. This will of course set you back more money, but you will have a rifle and not a smoothbore carbine. Now there are two other options remaining, both with a common thread, this being the rifle shop. Located in Oklahoma, USA, they can best be described as a bespoke gun shop. There are very few staff, and the lion's share of their time is spent making parts for a huge number of historical arms, including these many patterns of Baker. They are simply the best course for reproduction parts of the highest quality for the Baker, lock, stock, and barrel. They offer what some may call kits for nearly all of their products. Perhaps a better description, rather than kit, is a parts set. The stock is shaped and the major inlets are cut. Perhaps in all, 85% of the work is done. The wood is walnut and of good quality. The metal parts are all in their rough cast state, with sprue of varying size still attached. This includes the lock and the springs. The barrel is made by the American company Coleraine and is of commercial quality, they being the purveyors of many barrels for historical arms. They come with an historical but not ordnance pattern of rifling, having 6 grooves which are round-bottomed and have a twist of around 1 to 60 inches. Enquiries may lead to other arrangements. The assembly of the parts set is not like putting together a model kit. It requires basic hand tools such as files, chisels, and gouges. On top of this, the ability to wield these is in direct relationship to your finished product. The fit of the metal to wood as delivered is very close, and care must be taken not to remove too much of either in the inletting process. Of all the Baker options, this is easily the most rewarding to its owner by far. If you have neither the ability, confidence, nor the facilities to make a Baker yourself, there are further options. Having a Baker made for you. There are shops and vendors who will supply the Baker enthusiast with a top-quality, handmade example. Far and away, this will be made with parts from the rifle shop. At one point, the rifle shop would provide this service themselves, although presently I'm not sure they continue to do so. This option is by far the biggest investment in the time and money department. After all, you are paying for someone to make you a rifle from essentially scratch. Quality costs both. Of course, all of this doesn't preclude you finding an original. As you might expect, original Baker rifles in usable condition are extremely rare. Not only do they command a premium in price, but far and away, the most oft-seen patterns are those that one might consider to be volunteer pattern Bakers. Although generally similar, these were made for the Volunteer Rifle Corps that sprung up around the UK during the era. Thus, they don't necessarily conform strictly to the ordnance pattern Baker rifle. Different patch boxes, locks, and various arrangements of stocking are typically the differences you see between these and those issued to the regular army. So there are your options as an aspiring Baker owner, I'm afraid. There is no Traditions or Ruger or even Pedersoli out there making reproduction Baker rifles. And now, to answer the first question posed at the beginning. Where did I get my Baker from? Firstly, I have owned 2 Baker rifles. Yes, 2. My first Baker was a rebarreled Indian example, purchased from what was known as the Discriminating General in Canada. It was a typical Indian example, with strange wood, rough inletting and assembly. They had, at the time, a relationship with Ed Rail, who they recommended for rebarreling work. This I did, and received the completed rifle some months later. It had a proper 7-groove barrel with a 1 1/20-inch twist, and the addition of a vent liner. The whole experience was not without some friction, mostly in the customer service department with the initial vendor, but patience and regular correspondence at my end got me there. Once in my hands, the rifle was a go-to for many years, but there were things that did not meet my expectations, particularly as it pertained to the lock. It worked, but it required the standing on one leg, with the tongue held just so when tightening the side nails after assembly, or too much tension would result in binding with the wood. Some subsequent inletting was done to partial avail. I had a great time with this, my first Baker, and put it through its paces up to 200 yards, where it performed to my satisfaction. Eventually, I succumbed to the slippery slope and decided to get something of higher quality. Enter the rifle shop. I opted for the part set to assemble as a project, but as dealing with tempering springs was not something I wanted to attempt out of the gate, I asked them to assemble the lot. They provided this service, and it was money well spent at the time. Sadly, it would seem they have discontinued this service. They also cut the dovetails in the barrel for the keyways, sling swivel loop, and the sights. I was able to contact them periodically for questions and queries. This was not the easiest of undertakings at the time, as they didn't do email, and catching them on the phone was rather difficult, as they were predominantly in the shop making parts. I made the order with the options indicated and then promptly forgot all about it. I had been counseled on the reality of dealing with the rifle shop, and therefore my expectations were heavily managed. I knew not to expect the parcel anytime soon. I cannot remember how many months later, 8 or 10 perhaps, when a long cardboard box arrived, much to my confusion. What the hell did I just order? Then, mercifully, the penny dropped and I realized that this was in fact the Baker. Off to the basement shop I went. Let's just say it was well worth the wait. I wish I had filmed at least some of the process, but this was long before British muzzleloaders was even a consideration, so all I have are some pictures. There were some queries that I had involving the fitting of parts, and the rifle shop answered all of my questions. As well, a number of forms were helpful in the kind answers I got there. I completed the rifle over the spring and summer months, and by the late summer I was shooting it.
That feel.
I guess that's a good omen when the first round goes off, eh?
When I said that this option is the most rewarding to the owner, I'm not kidding. To have made it, finished, and fit its many parts, browned the barrel, finished the stock, and then shoot it was perhaps the most rewarding firearms experience in my life. My Baker is of the so-called 1800 pattern, and has all the usual associated hallmarks. The stock is somewhat more swept than later patterns. This, combined with the distinctive patchbox lid, are perhaps the most salient features. The patchbox lid has a peculiar shoulder arrangement at the hinge. As well, internally, there are 2 compartments. Among other things, these were used to hold basic tools, jags, ball pullers, and a torque bar. The butt features a cheek rest and makes for very comfortable shooting. There's a brass escutcheon at the wrist of the stock, and the customary brass scroll-type trigger guard. It features the flat, ring-necked cock of ordnance pattern Baker rifles, and not the swan-neck cock commonly associated with other reproductions. The back sight is of a 2-position flip-type leaf. Mine is calibrated for 100 yards and 200 yards. Peculiar to the 1800 pattern, and being changed in the 1805 pattern, the underside of the forestock is solid. Later, there was a slot milled in it to allow for dirt and debris to fall out, thereby allowing the ramrod to fully seat. The barrel is held on with 3 keys, spaced evenly along the forestock. These are slid out, held captive by an internal pin to allow for barrel removal. And there are 2 ramrod pipes, a middle and an upper. Just forward of the upper ramrod pipe, there's a sling swivel, which also helps to hold the barrel in the stock. And of course the very distinctive bar for fixing of the sword. The front sight is made of brass and fit in a dovetail. As mentioned, the internals of the barrel are somewhat ahistorical. They are patterned after a volunteer version of the Baker and feature 6 round bottom grooves. My version, however, is rifled in the 1 to 120 inch twist of ordnance pattern Bakers. The heavy steel ramrod features a swell below the head. To date, my Baker remains my most comfortable rifle to hold and to shoot. Baker's design, including the scroll-type trigger guard and the easy cant of the stock, bring the sights effortlessly to my eye. My Baker was the first such project of any kind I had ever attempted. I was apprehensive, ecstatic, worried, and even dead scared at various times during the build, but in the end, as mentioned, completely rewarded. I hope you enjoyed this little jaunt down the path to answering those 2 questions. Where did I get my Baker from, And how do you get one yourself? It's been a long time coming. Now, if Pedersoli would just get off their behinds and produce a version with their considerable resources, the community would be much better off. Thanks to the Royal Armouries, who allow use of their photographs for non-commercial purposes. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. And for more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page.
I like this.
When it goes, it goes.